Okay, hello everyone. Oops, sorry. It's almost 3:40. It's almost 3:45. I am Barbara Parker. I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the UCSD Emeriti Association. And it's my pleasure during our announcement phase of this general meeting and lecture series to introduce Wayne Kennedy, who is going to give us an update on our Chancellor Scholars Program. Wayne, have you signed on?
He is not in yet.
Okay, we will wait a couple of moments then. And then at that point, I will turn over the following hour to Dick Madsen, who will introduce our speaker, Professor Gary Jacobson, and the lecture for today.
Did you want to speak a little bit about Panunzio, Barbara?
Yes, there is a system-wide award for social sciences emeriti professors who have significant accomplishments, exemplary accomplishments during their retirement period. And the award requires a nomination letter and 2 letters of references and a CV. And each campus gets to nominate 1 individual. And then there is a campus-wide competition. And ultimately in the spring, the awardee is announced. The amount of the award is at least $10,000. I don't recall exactly. But we would be pleased to receive any self or other nominations from social sciences emeriti professors. Okay, Wayne Kennedy is just joined. Okay. Wayne, are you there? Hello, Wayne. So Wayne Kennedy is our director of our Chancellor Scholars and Emeriti Mentorship Program of the Emeriti Association. And we are taking the opportunity to provide an update to our emeriti attending this lecture series. Wayne, please provide an update to us.
Thank you. We welcomed 40 new Chancellor Scholars at a reception for the scholars and their mentors at the Faculty Club on September 25th. It was a very lively event and provided an opportunity for the mentors to interact with their mentees, some like myself for the first time. The Emeriti Association also hosted a barbecue for the scholars on October 5th, which also provided another opportunity for social interaction among the scholars and the mentors. And throughout the fall, there will be a number of special programs for the scholars. Among them will be presentations on effective communications, managing stress, and intercultural communications, among others. On November 5th, the Emeriti Association Mentoring Committee met with Chancellor Khosla to present the annual report of the Chancellor's Scholarship Program and to thank him for his continued support of the program. It was a very productive meeting in that the Chancellor expressed enthusiastic support for the program, and we left the meeting with some expectations that additional financial support for the program may be forthcoming. We'll have to stay tuned for that. I would like to encourage all of you to consider becoming a mentor and encouraging your colleagues to be mentors. It's a very rewarding experience and is vital to the success of the program. And then finally, we encourage you to contribute to the Emeriti Association Chancellor Scholarship Fund. Our contributions help in convincing the Chancellor to increase his support to the program. Thank you, and I will be glad to answer any questions.
Wayne, it might be helpful for those who are less familiar with our Chancellor Scholars Program to explain how the characteristics that the Chancellor Scholars have in terms of their academic performance and the backgrounds from which they come.
Okay, these are all first-generation students who are highly academically qualified, but have some financial difficulties. And they're selected through the admissions process at UCSD. They receive a $5,000 scholarship from the Emeriti Association, which is provided through donations to the association, along with money that's raised from the 5K run every year and other endowment funds that are available to the university. We take in 40 new mentee or scholars a year. And so it's a total of about 160 students that we are involved in the program. They're required to have a mentor for their first and second years, and then it's optional after that. Many of them stay with their mentors through their entire UCSD experience. I have been a mentor for 7 years, and it is an extraordinarily rewarding activity. I've enjoyed every one of my students, and my very first student actually graduated and now works for UCSD, and I actually keep in touch with her and have lunch with her once or twice a year. So I would encourage all of you to consider becoming a mentor. If you're interested, you can check with Vanya and get the information.
Wonderful, Wayne. Thank you so much. Are there questions from attendees regarding the Chancellor Scholars or Emeriti Mentor Program? If not, we'll move on to the lecture, which I see a record number of people are signing into today. So we are delighted that we have such a timely topic. Richard or Dick Madsen will, our Vice President of the Emeriti Association, will introduce our speaker and the topic.
Okay. Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce Gary Jacobson. Gary, I won't talk about all the awards and honors he's gotten. It would take too long. We want to hear what he has to say about the election. He's been here basically as long as I have, as far as I know, at UCSD. He has a long career in political science, American politics. Special focus for much of his work has been on elections, congressional elections especially, but all kinds of elections. And I hope he can shed some light, data-driven analysis about what happened last week, the presidential election, but I hope you can maybe say some things also about congressional elections. So with that, floor is open, Gary.
Thanks, Dick. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for all inviting me and coming to Zoom in on this lecture. The election is over, but we're still sifting the results. It's given us lots of things to think about and talk and consider. Really far more things than I can really cover well in a 40-minute discussion. So consider these kind of preliminary notes on figuring out what was going on in this election. Clearly, Trump won a decisive but fairly narrow victory. Republicans won control of the Senate. They're probably going to control the House. But the country remains very evenly divided between the two parties, highly polarized. And the election, it turns out, shows much more continuity with recent elections than any kind of dramatic change from the patterns that we've seen in the past. So I will try to fill that out today. I'm going to start, I'm going to screen share my PowerPoint slides. I'm going to try. Let's see there. And I'm going to begin with the first slide, which is by far the most important one in
Yeah, just started.
Can everyone see that that slide? Is it visible?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Is there any way you can get rid of that black banner up top?
I certainly hope so.
If you go to more and you click on more,
What if I go just take it down here? Does that work? And that really doesn't work.
Professor Jacobson, if you go to more, the 3 dots on the end,
Yes.
if you click on those, I think you should be able to hide floating controls.
Let's hide. Let's see. Okay. Okay. All right. Okay. By historical standards, the 2024 election should have produced a very easy Republican victory. The only reasons the Democrats had any chance at all was that Donald Trump was the Republican nominee, making the election a referendum on him rather than on simply the current administration. Presidential elections with an incumbent or an incumbent party are always, to some extent, and usually to a great extent, referendums on the party currently in power. The enduring issues, as everyone knows, are peace and prosperity. The economy almost always matters, but it matters much more when people are unhappy with it. The answer to the classic question, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago, always has a major economic component, although other elements, other factors may matter as well. In 2024, a majority of Americans said no, they were not better off than they were 4 years ago. And a majority said they were better off under the previous administration of Donald Trump than they were under the Biden administration. They were also unhappy with other components of the Biden administration. This slide here tells you the most important story about the election. The green line is the inflation rate. The blue line is the unemployment rate. They're both indexed on the left side of the chart. And then there are two other measures of survey data on the proportion of people saying the economy was poor rather than just mediocre or good, and the proportion saying the economy was getting worse. And as you can see, as inflation went up, negative views of the economy went up, despite the fact that unemployment was falling. As inflation came down, negative views of the economy didn't, or they didn't by very much. And they more than 40, by around the time of the election, more than 40% of the population thought the economy was in poor shape, and almost half thought it was actually getting worse. And this is despite steady economic growth, very low unemployment, record stock market prices, et cetera. This is not what most of the public perceived. An interesting survey question asked this year was, what's the best index of what's the best measure of how the economy is performing? A solid majority, say like 55%, said it was inflation. Another 15% said unemployment. 5% said the stock market. So what people were seeing out there was the remnants of inflation. Even as it came down, of course, prices didn't fall. They just didn't rise so fast. And so a large majority of the American public felt they were suffering from the consequences of this period of inflation and were thoroughly unhappy about it. Even low unemployment doesn't help if the wages aren't keeping up with prices, and people who are employed are still struggling or feel like they're struggling economically. It wasn't until this year where the wage growth started to catch up with the rate of inflation.
Excuse me, Gary, there are a couple
Yes.
of people stating that they can't see the speaker's screen. So, Vanya, are there any potential issues with screen sharing? Christopher,
The screen I'm seeing is inflation and unemployment on the one side, economy poor, growing, or getting
Right.
worse on the right.
Yeah.
That should be the slide. Who is having issues?
Christopher Clark and Randolph Hastings
And Kenneth Jones.
and Kenneth
That-
Jones.
And I also cannot see what's going to do.
So,
Elizabeth Wynan, I can't see the screen.
Do you mind stopping your sharing, Professor Jacobson, and trying once more?
I
can
can
see the
try.
screen.
Okay, there's stop share
Mhm.
and share once more.
I see it.
Yep. I've
That's
got
it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now I have to get rid of that thing again.
Yeah, now the bar is in the wrong place.
Okay, now can everybody see it?
Looks good.
Yes.
Great.
Okay. Let me continue. Presidents, well, just to finish up, Biden's rating on the economy was negative. His rating on inflation was even more negative. And this economic discontent fed a general unhappiness with the direction of the country, with typically around 65% saying it was on the wrong track, 24% on the right track. Those are very bad numbers. Along with prosperity, peace is usually an important issue. The U.S. was not at war. There was the kind of chaotic and hasty departure from Afghanistan, which hurt Biden's reputation, but it did not really become much of an election issue. But the sharp rise in immigration in 2021 to 2023 created another kind of national security issue that Biden addressed too late. And then trying to address it, he was thwarted by the congressional Republicans listening to Trump and for refusing to enact his legislation. So it was a problem for Democrats. It was a problem for Biden that didn't go away. Only about 30% approved of his handling of the issue. And sentiments on the economy, sentiments on immigration improved a little bit under Harris, but they didn't go away entirely. And she was really not able to set them aside and overcome them. If you look back to Biden's overall performance numbers, it was a ratings about 40%. No president has ever been reelected with such low approval numbers. The minimum has been about 46%, 48%. Harris was, as I will show you later, did a little bit better after replacing him. But she wasn't unable to overcome, I think, this set of national sentiments. And I don't think any Democratic candidate could have overcome those national sentiments very easily. She did improve while Biden was still running. Trump had a much wider advantage on who could handle both the economy and immigration better. That advantage shrunk substantially when Harris took over, but it didn't shrink to zero. It was around in the order of 6 to 10 points, and that's not trivial. Now, national conditions like this, as I said, were such that a standard Republican candidate should have won very easily. But the candidate was Donald Trump, and he's the main reason that Harris had any chance at all. I don't need to remind you too much about Donald Trump or his experience, but you know he's returned from exile in Mar-a-Lago to win the Republican nomination and to win the presidency, and defying the ignominy of 2 impeachments, his attempts to overturn the 2020 election that led to the invasion and trashing of the Capitol, the loss of 3 civil cases for sexual assault, defamation, and falsifying business record, his loss of a criminal case for lying about hush money payments to a porn star, and then federal indictments for mishandling classified documents, obstructing the government efforts to retrieve them, and then indictments for conspiring to overturn the election at the state level. No wonder half the population considers him totally unfit. Nearly half the population considers him totally unfit for the presidency. But a little more than half decided that he was. And in fact, none of his post-2020 election behavior, legal troubles did very much to erode his support among his Republican base. More than 2/3 to this day believe the big lie that he actually won the election, and that number hasn't changed since 2021. Moreover, in viewing his various legal indictments, the very large majority simply don't believe them, don't accept them, don't think he is guilty of any of the things for which he's accused. This chart has, I think, pretty remarkable data. The blue line is Democrats, the red line is Republicans, the green line independents. It shows that a majority of Americans and a majority of independents and a vast majority of Democrats thought that Trump was responsible for January 6th. He should have been impeached. He obstructed the election. He was hiding classified documents. He paid the hush money. He misvalued his property. He was engaged in sexual abuse. And this final one, He's questioned, did he ever commit any crime ever? A question that's been asked a few times. A little parenthetical number there is the number of surveys that were averaged to get these figures. And what you notice here is that only a small minority of Republicans hold him culpable in any of these things. Mostly in the teens, up to 25% for misvalued property and any crime ever. And in fact, when he was indicted for these things, a large majority of his supporters of Republicans accepted his argument that this was a witch hunt. These were all false charges. He was not guilty. And even those who thought he was perhaps culpable tended to downplay the seriousness of any of these items, saying, "Yeah, he might have done it, but it wasn't very important." The question, and it's a deep question, and that I'm not going to have a full answer at all this afternoon. The question is, why the tenacity of his support? Why do they stick with him no matter what? And I think the key element is the sense of shared identity, which Trump has forged with his MAGA followers by effectively presenting himself as a championship of mainly white Americans who feel besieged economically, culturally, by globalism, immigration, feminism, secularism, the growing ethnic and racial diversity of the country, etc. Trump has been able to voice and help validate their resentments, grievances, antipathies of a large number of people who feel ignored or belittled by cultural, corporate, political elites in both parties. He expresses their sentiments in their language. They are excited and entertained rather than put off by his over-the-top, nasty rhetoric. He has succeeded in persuading millions of disaffected Americans, especially the less educated non-urban whites and white evangelical Christians, that he is on their side, that his enemies are their enemies, and that attacks on him are attacks on them. That is, he's managed to keep their attention and keep their beliefs on his side. They thus choose to believe him rather than the mainstream media or dissenting Republican leaders. They employ all of the familiar modes of motivated reasoning, either avoiding, ignoring, disbelieving, discounting, excusing, or dismissing as irrelevant anything suggesting that he might not deserve their support. He demonizes anyone who exposes or refutes any of his incessant lies. He forces his supporters then to choose between believing him and believing them. And the vast majority have chosen to believe him. There were more than a dozen polls asked during his administration, who do you believe, Trump or the news media? The average was 78% Trump, 13% the news media. We saw a nice example of this during the campaign. Something like half the Republicans, a little more than half of Trump supporters, said it was definitely or probably true that Haitian immigrants are abducting and eating pet dogs and cats. So you come up with a story like that, and you can get half of his following to follow it. Now, outside of the MAGA world, Trump is much less popular, to say the least. He has had very little crossover appeal to Democrats. Even though he won a national majority of votes, a national majority have never viewed him favorably. If you look at the course of opinions of Trump over the course of his time in office and until now, you can see what happened, especially among Republicans. They're the ones that essentially move here. He lost support after January 6th. He lost a little more support into 2023, especially at the time of just after the midterm election, which the Republicans underperformed their expectations. And then after that, it was all uphill, especially with the boost given by his indictments, which brought him sympathy from Republicans, and then his response to the assassination attempt gave him a final boost. So Republicans were given him for everything, disbelieve most of the negative information about him, and decided they have a favorable opinion of him. On the other end, the Democrats down there in blue don't. I don't have to explain to this group, I think, why, unless you like endless mendacity, racism, sexual abuse, authoritarian impulses, corruption, ignorance, cruelty, contempt for the Constitution, the legal system, other institutions, etc. There's a long list. And in fact, most Americans don't have a positive opinion of Trump even to this day. In the average in the pre-election polls that I'm going to be showing you next, they're from the Economist YouGov series with about 20,000 observations from a bunch of polls taken over the last 4 months. 47% expressed very unfavorable views of Trump, 7% somewhat unfavorable, and only 45% favorable. The problem for Democrats was that 7% who were unfavorable, half of them voted for Trump anyway. Trump's core support is not large enough to win the election, but he was able to add to it voters who were not wild about him, but who believed that they would be better off economically with him in the White House, and who were upset with the surge of immigrants, but also from people who may not have liked Trump, but had very negative views of Biden administration and of Kamala Harris. So one important reason why Trump maintains support is that he's convinced people to dislike his enemies intensely. Succeeded in demonizing his opposition, so that even people who don't think aren't very fond of what he's doing on a particular day or very fond of what he's saying still don't like the Democrats, even less. To look at some survey data, next, this is data from pre-election. So the final pre-election average here had Harris about 51-49 over Trump. It's actually been the other way. The actual vote 51-49 for Trump, but still pretty close to the actual result. You can see from this the usual pattern of Trump support among whites, much smaller support among blacks, and less support from a minority of Hispanics. The numbers for both blacks and Hispanics are up from similar data from 4 years ago. It was something like 7% for blacks back then, and maybe 34% for Hispanics back then. And then there's a clear age gradient where older voters favor Trump, younger voters less so, although he did better among younger voters this time around than he did in 2020. In fact, he did better among virtually every category this time around than in 2020. And the kind of universal swing in his favor across demographics, I think, is a direct reflection of economic discontent. Now, this will show up more clearly when we have some data on what people think how the economy is doing. In this chart, dark blue is poor, light blue is fair, and very light blue is excellent or good. Those numbers in white at the bottom are the proportion who fall into that category. So, for example, among men, 18% said the economy was poor. Among women, 28%, et cetera. What you can see here is that views of the economy had a very strong effect on support for Trump among both blacks and minorities, and that effect was strongest among men. So Hispanic men who thought the economy was performing poorly, 89% voted or supported Trump in these pre-election polls. Women somewhat less so, but still at 65%. So you have both a gender gradient, but within genders there's a very strong gradient depending on views of the economy. We look at age, you get the same kind of pattern. Those who thought the economy was poor, the dark reddish line here, the brick colored line here, were supported Trump. Those who didn't, who thought the economy was fair or excellent or good, tended not to. You see the breakout across the age gradient, and you can also see that attitudes toward the economy affected young men more than they affected young women, although young women had more likely to have a negative view of the economy. So the economy mattered enormously in this election. What also mattered was the immigration issue. Only way I could measure this in this survey was the attitudes toward Biden's handling of immigration, whether they approved or disapproved. And you can see from this that a majority of Americans disapproved of his handling of immigration, and 93% of them here were supporting Trump rather than Harris in the election. If you break it down by party, of course, partisans have very different views of how it was performing. Only 7% of Democrats disapprove very strongly. 91% of Republicans disapprove very strongly. But of those who defy their party consensus on this issue, they were far more likely to defect. You had 23% of Democrats defecting to Trump. Virtually all the Democrats who defected to Trump were those who thought Biden had handled immigration badly. There's a huge gradient among independents. You can see that the 58% of independents who disapproved strongly of his performance were 85% supporting Trump. But notice among the Republicans, those who weren't so negative, not very many of them, but those who weren't so negative about his performance on immigration were more likely to defect from their party to Harris. And again, if you look at the same question broken down by ethnicity, there's a huge gradient depending on how they felt about Trump's handling or Biden's handling of immigration. Notice in particular Hispanics. 42% strongly disapproved of how Biden was handling immigration. And you might think that, well, yeah, they might think he was either too tough or too easy, but their voting behavior suggests they thought he was being too easy, with 85% of them voting for Trump. So the swing of minorities to Trump, which is real, is largely rested on both the economy and on views of the immigration issue. I'll give you one more demographic chart. This is just one that reminds us of what the electorate looks like right now. There's a very strong gradient depending on education, with Republicans and Trump doing much better among people with less than with high school education or just some college, doing worse among college graduates, and even worse among people with graduate degrees. These are white voters. Among non-whites, there doesn't seem to be any age gradient at all. But these numbers on whites are a little bit higher for high school and some college than they were in the past. But this is a pattern that's been developing for the past couple of decades and has just reached a kind of a peak in this election. Now I would like to shift attention to something else, a little historical perspective on this election, to suggest that although Republican victory was striking and is going to be highly consequential, the changes in voting patterns that brought this about were historically quite small, and they were very consistent, very uniform across states, which is, again, historically unusual. And they were very consistent with the results of the last couple of elections. The first column here, these are years in which the incumbent party was voted out of power. And the first is the size of the swing to the incumbent against the incumbent party to the out party. In 2024, it was about 2.4 percentage points. That's the average across states. The standard deviation measures how uniform that swing is. The lower the standard deviation, the more uniform the swing. And the standard deviation here is remarkably low, both for 2020 and 2024, as is the correlation with the result in the same state 4 years earlier. There's a pattern of very stable electoral system, but with some swing sort of across the board. And this is essentially what we got in 2024. Actually, the average swing to Trump was smaller in the states that he took from Biden, that Biden had won in 2020, and overall about 2 percentage points swing on average. So it all moved in the same direction, and it was very decisive in terms of the outcome. But it didn't represent a great tidal wave of support for Trump or for the Republican Party. Compare that to 2008, when Obama defeated Bush. There was a bigger swing, and there was considerably more variance across states in in the shifts between them. So the picture here is of a highly nationalized electorate, evenly balanced between the parties. It's characterized by a high level of stability and rigidity. It's under these circumstances that voter turnout becomes very important. Partisans don't defect much. There isn't much movement between one side and the other. So turnout becomes very important. And at least preliminary data suggests that the Republicans turned out their supporters. Trump turned out his supporters more effectively than Harris did. And that was clearly a decisive thing. Now, it was a very eventful campaign, and I haven't talked about any of the campaign events. It turns out analytically, they didn't make a heck of a lot of difference in terms of how people planned to vote. I looked at some 334 surveys taken in 2024 and just ran a regression to see what happened to the numbers after various campaign events. So prior to the Biden debate, the average was Trump had an average share of 50.3. After the debate, he gained a 1.5. This was, a debacle of a debate, and everyone was kind of shocked by it. But the actual effect on voting intentions was relatively modest, but it gave Trump a 51.4 share. When Harris replaced Biden, there was a surge toward the Democrats. Again, it was heavily remarked on. There was a great sense of relief expressed by Democrats that Biden was now gone. And it did shift the numbers in her favor, but not by a huge amount, by a couple of points. After the first debate with Harris, Harris did better than Trump, put him on the defensive, and she kind of got the peak of her campaign. His numbers were down to 48.2%. Trump recovered after the vice presidential debate. I'm not arguing here that debate had anything to do with it, but it kind of represents the fading of the burst of support for Harris that took place after she replaced Trump and after the first debate. By the time of the election day, according to this survey, Trump's share of the vote should be 49.3%. He did better than that by 1.8%. There are various reasons for that, but that's by the standards of survey research. Being within less than 2 points of the actual result is usually a pretty happy outcome. And I also looked at, did it make any difference that he was convicted in the hush money case? No, it didn't. Did it shift things when he was? Did the attempted assassination make any difference? The answer seems to be no. So these events that kind of punctuated a raucous year had an effect on voting intentions, but it wasn't a huge one because the electorate just doesn't move around very much on these things these days. Now, the question arises then, did the campaigns matter? There's a lot to go over before we can decide that. But basically, campaigns matter when they kind of confirm what people are thinking, when they kind of fix what seems to be floating around out there in the public mind and say, all right, this is what the election was about. Campaigns don't change minds. What they do is they try to frame the election in a way that favors their side. And the frame that people use in this campaign, in this election, tended to be the one that Trump was pushing. It was the economy, it was immigration, and not the frames that Harris was pushing. Abortion, the maintenance of democracy, etc. So it was a debate. The campaigns mattered, but they mattered because they brought to the fore the things that were available, and the Trump campaign used what was available to them to frame the campaign in a way that favored their side. This was an election year when about 3/4 of the voters wanted change, and Trump was perceived as the most likely producer of change. And as we're seeing with his cabinet appointments, change is certainly going to be in the air. On the congressional election results for Dick, Again, the nationalization of politics is very evident in congressional election results. There, in the congressional election results, on the Senate side, as you can see, there was a very strong relationship between how well Trump did in the state, how well the partisan candidates did. Democrats were actually lucky here. They won. They lost 4 states that had been won by Trump, 3 of them quite handily. But notice they also won 4 states where Trump won. He didn't win by very much. So they're bunched down there in the middle of the graph. But this is typical now. In 2020, there was no state that produced a split outcome. That is, every state went to the same Senate candidate who won of the party who won the presidential vote in that state. And in 2016, that was the case. In 2020, there was only one that didn't fall along the diagonal, didn't fall into the right quadrant. So there was a little more ticket splitting in the Senate elections in 2020 than in 2024 than there had been in 2020 or 2016, but still not very much. Similar story in the House. We don't have the district level presidential vote for 2024 yet. That won't be out for another 3 or 4 months. But if you use the district level 2020 vote and the 2024 House vote, you can see there's an extremely strong relationship between them. People voted for the House at the district level as they had voted for the House at the presidential level in 2024. So a very high correlation here. The point being, the point to both of these charts being that elections are now highly nationalized events and president-centered events. And with an evenly divided polity, then you can have sharp swings in partisan control with rather modest shifts in voter sentiments. Okay, so to wind up, the question for the second Trump administration is, can they govern? We'll see. They're guaranteed to disappoint at least some significant sections of their voters. His MAGA supporters voted for him because of what he promised to do on things like immigration, economic protectionism, revenge against their common enemies, etc. But a lot would put him over the top were the votes of people who heard this but didn't really believe that he was going to do it. They thought he was doing his usual Trump performances, that his bark would be worse than his bite. He wouldn't really do so many things that were so potentially disruptive and potentially damaging to the national economy. Certainly tariffs would raise inflation, getting rid of, expelling 10 million immigrants, undocumented immigrants, would devastate the economy, especially the farm economy, restaurants, construction, and so forth. So if he's going to do these things, they would have dramatically negative effects, I think, on the economy in the short run, for sure, and would be unwelcome to that faction of his support that simply wanted him to be kinder to business, to do some deregulation, to allow mergers to go through. So his coalition is going to be disappointed in one part or the other, but it's going to be a rocky road before we find out what's going to happen. So let me get back to my Zoom. Okay, how much time did I use? Only a half hour, 40 minutes.
So we have about a half hour for questions, and there are a lot of questions that come up. So thank you very, very much. This puts so much of it in perspective. Maybe to start off, Gary, just maybe more trivial question, but there's some commentary, that racism and sexism, against Harris was a factor. Is there any way to tease that out of the kind of data you have, or is it, do you have evidence that it was not a factor at all?
Well, I'm sure it's a factor. The question is how big, and that's hard to measure. I saw a survey taken just after the election asking people, would you vote for, do you want a woman to be president? And all the Democrats said yes, and about 30% of the Trump voters said no. I mean, ever. They didn't look forward to the idea of having a woman president. So there was some sexism in there. You don't know whether or not that was necessary, as opposed to, it's necessary for them to support Trump. They've probably supported him for many other reasons, but among Trump supporters, there's going to be, I think, detectable sexism and detectable racism. There was in 2020, there was in 2016. So it's one element of is common in his support, but it's hard to argue that was the decisive thing, or that a male Kamala Harris would have performed appreciably better, given the fundamentals that were in place at the time of the election.
Okay. Well, I'm sure there are a lot of other questions, so I'm going to let other people ask some things. Maybe I'll ask a few things at the end. So the floor is open.
Christine, you had a question?
Yes, thank you so much, Gary. Always an impressive analysis with a lot of quantitative data. I'm a little bit concerned about with Trump's election is the international arena and the environmental issues. Do you have any thoughts about what can happen, what would happen, what the consequences will be, both for the status of the United States and the world at the end, NATO inclusive?
I can see nothing but downside in a Trump administration, either for NATO, for the rest of the world, and certainly for the global climate. He's a climate change denier. He wants to put more carbon into the atmosphere, and he's going to have a fairly compliant Congress. We'll just see how strong resistance can be mounted against this. But I think it's really a major setback for the planet. It's likely to be a major setback for our relations with our allies. I think the Ukrainians should be very worried at this point that he's going to pull the rug from under him. He's not going to stand up to Putin, and he's going to sacrifice their interests. So yeah, I think there's going to be quite profound consequences internationally. These things did not show up in the vote, except with regard to the fact that the war between Israel and Hamas and Hezbollah probably hurt the Democrats a bit. Certainly, it hurt them in Michigan, where Arab Americans shifted dramatically against Harris compared to how they had voted for Biden. They're bound to be sorry for it, because Trump's going to be worse for their side than Harris would have been. But they wanted to punish her, and they acted in that fashion.
Okay. Let's see, Jeff Wall.
Hi, Gary. Thanks very much for a really stimulating, if not depressing, presentation. You said that campaigns matter. And in this regard, I have two questions. One is, in one of Kamala Harris's earliest interviews, she was asked, what would you do differently than the Biden-Harris administration had done? And she said nothing. And she actually was asked that question several times and always had the same answer. Is there any way of assessing how much that early response hurt her? And the second question is there any way of assessing how much the hundreds of millions of dollars that Elon Musk put in and the efforts that his PAC exhibited in terms of getting the vote out in kind of non-traditional ways, not knocking on doors or anything like that, but actually going through social media, some of which he owns and is very impactful, affected the vote. Because again, as you pointed out, it was kind of a narrow election when you come down to it.
Yeah, on the first question, yeah, Harris made a fundamental mistake by not answering that question with something like, we did some good things, we've probably made some mistakes. Going forward, I would have moved on immigration sooner, or I would have done more to bring down inflation, et cetera, et cetera. Whether she could or, whether there's anything that could be done is another matter. But she clearly didn't distinguish herself from the administration. Now, I think it would be very hard for anyone in an administration to do that, but it would have been hard even from a candidate who was not part of the administration, not to carry the burden of his own party and his own administration. You wouldn't have won the nomination by trashing Biden. You'd have to treat him respectfully and kindly, and you couldn't win the nomination by telling everyone how bad your party had been. So I think that Harris had a especially difficult time there, and she didn't handle it particularly effectively. But it's a burden that would have, I think, handicapped any Democrat coming into that position. With regard to Musk, I think that may have had an effect. I think there'll be some studies of that. You can study changes in turnout at kind of the micro level. You can look at the precinct level, or at least at the county level, state's legislative district level, and so forth. And we should be able to measure shifts in voter turnout amongst subgroups that are concentrated in particular areas. So it may be that we'll have some handle on how effective these things were. And I wouldn't be surprised if they had some effect. We'll see if young male voters turned out in unusual numbers. We might attribute, and especially if they turned out on unusual numbers in places like Pennsylvania and Michigan, that might have contributed to Trump's gains in those states. So that's a real possibility. But again, campaigns work when they have something to work with. And in this case, the Trump campaign found something to work with. And that same level of effort by outside forces like those who helped Trump don't work if they don't have something to work with.
Okay, I think Joel, is that you have a hand up?
Yes. Hi, Gary. Thanks.
Hi, Joel.
Thanks for the analysis. So all these people who felt that the economy is terrible, what do they really expect Trump to do to improve it?
They have no idea. The economy is bad. It was better when Trump was president. When Trump is president again, it will get better again because if you ask them, they'll say, well, he was a businessman. They have to have a naive view of his skills as a businessman. But I think Trump is going to be very lucky. The economy is in good shape. He's inheriting, as he did after the Obama administration. He's inheriting a strong economy, low unemployment, inflation's coming down. That the unhappiness with prices that remains will be blamed on Biden, not Trump. So he's inheriting a very strong economy, and his charge is going to be not to screw it up. And he can only not screw it up by not doing things he says he wants to do, like 10% across the board tariffs. That's strictly inflationary. Booting out a large segment of the workforce is going to be inflationary. Raise the cost of labor, raise the cost of food, raise the cost of construction. So I think that it's more magical thinking than analytical thinking, that when we put Trump in there, he's going to do things to make the economy work better. It's thinking that, well, it was better before, it got worse, now we can make it better again by having Trump come back. And I think it's not any deeper than that.
Any other hands right now? Maybe waiting for one. I can ask something. What about the COVID? What about his handling of the pandemic? And did that have any effect on
Unfortunately for Biden, no. In the first year of his administration, he had very strong numbers on COVID. That was his best issue. People were happy with the return to normal life, was happy that they were getting vaccinated, happy that the economy was was getting better again. He was riding very high. But by the a year and a half later, it was just off the radar screen. It was no longer an issue. It was behind us. We were no longer worried about it. And so the fact that he had done a much better job than Trump in managing it from the point of view of the White House cut him no slack later on. It was just no longer in people's minds. And people had forgotten just how badly Trump had mismanaged the crisis, partly because the one good thing he did, speeding up the vaccines, worked remarkably well. He couldn't take credit for it because it would anger his base. They didn't like vaccines. They didn't like vaccine mandates. But the fact that he had done it kind of insulated him, to a large degree from the fact that his performance as president during the crisis was pretty bad.
Tim Dresslow's here. I don't think my hand could get raised. Can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
Yeah, I appreciate the presentation and the data that you shared with us. Just one question also about a demographic. I think in some places, at least is my perception from reports I've seen, that the Jewish vote showed up more for Trump than it had in previous cycles. Is that correct? And if so, do you have any thoughts about that?
I don't know yet, and I wouldn't be a bit surprised because, as I said, he got votes from increased votes across the board from all demographics. And I would be surprised if Jews were an exception. I think he's clearly seen as being more supportive of Netanyahu and the current Israeli policies. So insofar as that swayed votes, yeah, it probably moved some Jewish voters, but I'd have to see data on that. I don't have that in my data set.
Thank you.
Okay. And I'm sorry, I don't recognize you. You have a question here.
Yeah. Barbara.
Oh,
could I unmute yourself, Barbara?
Actually, Jim Lynn has raised his hand a while ago.
Jim Lynn, yeah.
Thanks, Gary, for your analysis. It really so confusing, this election. But one thing that I think most of us are concerned about is, how do you think Trump's going to treat the universities? I mean, some of the universities are, very involved with environmental studies. I mentor a lot of students who are majoring in environmental studies, and I mentor students who, when they graduate now, it's very difficult to get a job. And so if Trump decides to not support climate change issues and also not support diversity, equity, and inclusion issues, these things could deeply be affected, and he could cut the National Science Foundation funding. So do you have any information about that? I mean, this could really affect UCSD and all of
yeah. I think there is a real danger that that there will be less investment in scientific research under Trump. Didn't talk much about it during the campaign. Did try to trash the universities, but the issue that he wants to trash them with is pretty much gone with the Supreme Court declaring affirmative action improper. That I don't expect the universities to be treated well compared to how they would be treated under a Harris administration, and they're going to have to be careful, sort of maintaining their own resources and their own base as much as they can. But I think they have a pretty strong base of support, public support, outside of very conservative, some very conservative precincts. And there's, I think, a good deal of residual faith in universities, especially public universities, that I think will help at least slow down the damage, write out the damage. But I think there's bound to be some. It's just not going to be a very sympathetic bunch running the cabinet positions, running the offices that affect us as university members.
Dick, Barbara Brody had her hand up.
Barbara, fine.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very stimulating presentation and for all the data you presented. I would like to ask you if you have any thoughts or data insight as to why the men, particularly the white men, were unhappy with the economy. Do you have any thoughts about what was going on behind that?
Well, I think two things. One is wages didn't keep up with inflation, and people who working 9 to 5 for wages, working for hourly wages, saw their economic situation worsen. Price of housing, the price of groceries, the price of restaurants, the price of gasoline, price of automobiles. All of these things are high, and they're things that people who are relatively low income or are sort of the lower end of the social economic scale get hit harder with. And I think they were hit hard with that. But there's a second and maybe deeper thing that explains the more long-term trend, is that their position in the society, their cultural relevance, et cetera, of lower educated working class men has been declining for some time. They don't like it. They resent it. And Trump promises to restore their status, independent of anything economic, restore their cultural status. They see him as their champion, as someone like them who speaks their language, and they love it. They enjoy it. It's both entertaining and makes them feel better about themselves. So I think that's a phenomenon that goes beyond the current economy and has to do with the growing economic inequality that we've been seeing for the last 40 years, where people without, at the lower end of the social economic scale, people without education, people not in the professions, have gotten a smaller and smaller share of the pie, and they resent it. They recognize it. Now, Trump's not going to do anything about that. Probably going to make things worse, but it does help to explain why there's this resentment at that level that spills over into cultural resentment, that all those people who look down on us because we're not we don't share the proper social views. So there's a long story there, but that's a piece of it.
Thank you. That was my intuition on this subject as well. And the question in my mind, and perhaps this is not the place for it, is what are some of the ways that we can bring everybody to feel more, particularly white males, being part of, and other men, all people, to have a sense of participation in society and respect.
Well, again, it's you have to make some changes in the economy. Ironically, some of those changes were being made under Biden's policies, investment in red states, in various kinds of manufacturing enterprises in red states that were designed to make for better employment opportunities in those areas, including jobs that didn't require a college education. And I think economic development in places that have been neglected is the way to go. But it's a very slow process. You don't get instant results from that. But you do get results. You do get some advantage from at least showing that you care and you're trying to do something. But it's hard to do if you're not in power.
Thank you.
See any more? If no one's hands are hands, but immediately I'll maybe ask something about this whole business of wokeness. You know, one of Trump's biggest ads had to do with the trans, people being accepted and so forth and so on. How much did that kind of thing affect the outcome?
I think it probably hurt Harris. Again, I don't think it was decisive. It's the current version of abortion. They can't use the abortion issue anymore to rally the Christian conservatives. So they have other social issues having to do with sex and gender and so forth to be used to rally social conservatives. So it was useful to keep that constituency from happy because Trump kind of backtracked on abortion, said, I'm going to leave it up to the states. And this was not something that was welcomed in the on his Christian conservative base. So the anti-wokeness becomes a kind of surrogate for that. And I think it probably worked effectively with that group. It also worked with some others. I think a lot of people who are not particularly conservative, who are not particularly Trump fans, are uneasy about gender change, things of that sort. It just kind of makes them a little bit queasy and uneasy. I've talked to old liberal friends that I've known for 40 years, and I'm kind of surprised that some of them say that they don't understand transgenderism, and that this is something that seems kind of alien, and we shouldn't focus on this, and maybe this is a kind of a fad that'll go away. So if there's that sentiment out there among people who aren't basic Trumpers to begin with, or Christian conservatives to begin with, that might have had some effect in making people think less of Harris. Again, I don't think it was a big thing, but a lot of little things can add up.
And maybe something about this in global context. In Europe, populist movements on the rise everywhere. Austria, Germany, France, Italy, certainly. Do they follow the same pattern as what we've seen here, or are there significant variations?
I think it's part of the same pattern. It's not liking social change that involves foreigners coming in and changing your culture, coming in and perhaps suggesting that you are not the carrier of culture, that you have to share it with other people. I think that's the explanation for places like Hungary, Italy, France, Germany, England, even that the immigration question has, I think, beset all of them because of people, especially people who are less cosmopolitan, more strongly identified with their communities, their families, just are very uncomfortable facing this kind of social change. And if someone tells them, well, you don't have to do this, we can undo it, they can get some support.
Okay. Is that Joel with a hand up?
And also, I had a hand up as well.
Oh,
Barbara
Barbara.
Parker. Yeah.
Okay, Barbara, you go first.
Yes. So, Gary, thank you so much for this data-driven presentation. Why did democracy and the rule of law, January 6th, for example, not get more traction?
Well, some of those data I showed you explain why. That a large chunk of the electorate, that is the Republican electorate, didn't think it was a problem. They thought the election was stolen.
And how can we change that? Or is it just a demagogue spouting lies and people believe him?
It gets harder and harder to change, to make people see the truth. There's a nice piece of analysis I read. People talk about motivated reasoning. There's a concept called motivated ignorance. And that is, if, say, you're a Trump supporter, and the question comes up, was the election stolen? And, you don't want to find out the truth, because the truth might make you not support Trump anymore. And you'd rather continue to support Trump because you identify with groups that support Trump. You want to be a Trumpian. You want to be the kind of person who supports Trump. And so you deliberately avoid learning things that would undermine your support for him. It's motivated ignorance. And it's easy to do. It's easy to maintain when you have a right-wing ecosystem of media supporting the lies, backing the lies, not challenging them. So it's not like you turn on the evening news and you learn that you were wrong about something. You don't turn on the program that tells you you're wrong. You turn on the programs, you go to the web sources that tell you that you're right. So it's very hard to penetrate that. The only thing that I think could have penetrated it is after January 6th, if a very large proportion of Republican politicians had decided that trashing the Capitol was a step too far, that Trump had taken it a step too far, and had come out forcefully and with a lot of consensus against him. Didn't happen. They looked at his supporters, decided they wanted to keep that constituency, and backed off. I keep wondering whether, blanking on his name, whether the majority leader of the Senate,
Mitch McConnell.
How can I blank on McConnell?
Because he's no longer the leader.
I guess he is. I wonder if he's kicking himself for not having supported impeachment at the beginning of 2021. He came pretty close by most accounts. And he probably could have pushed it over the top, and the Republicans could have put Trump behind them forever. And I'm wondering if he's had second thoughts about that at various times since then. Probably not in the long run. He's a very strong partisan, but that's when it could have happened, and it didn't. And the lie about the stolen election was propagated. I have some remarkable data on that, just how consistently the responses to that question have been over the past 4 years, with virtually nobody changing their mind about it. Very little erosion of belief that among Republicans and among Trump voters that Biden was legitimate. It was illegitimate. So it's just a very hard mindset to penetrate when people don't want, when it feels good to believe what they believe, and changing their minds would be painful. They don't want to face that pain, and so they don't.
Thank you.
And Joel, you have a question. Maybe this will be the last one because we're almost out of time. Go ahead.
So, Gary, there's a lot of people are talking about populist movements, rejection of intellectuals, rejection of elitism, technocrats. All of that kind of smells right to me, but I don't know how much quantitative polling data do we have about that phenomenon.
There's a fair amount on rating professions. Gallup's been rating professions for years and years and years, and intellectual professions like scientist, teacher, and so forth have declined in approval and in their ratings. They're not rated as high as they used to be. But I turn the question back on you that there's been an undercurrent of anti-intellectualism, at least in the U.S., for as long as I can remember, and probably as long as anyone can remember. It's not always at the forefront, but there's always been a kind of element of criticism of the hoity-toity elites. If you look in popular media, the character of the arrogant elite scientist, the arrogant elite, whatever, professional, as it's portrayed negatively on a regular basis, has been for a long time. I think it's come to the fore. It's more prominent now. There's less respect for authority of all kind, and that means intellectual authority as well. And of course, the availability of the internet to have supporters alternative versions of reality beyond what the scientific community accepts, it's become much easier to spread ideas like that, and so that may have something to do with it as well. But I think if you look at the data, you will find that there really has been an erosion of belief in scientific authority and other forms of social authority.
May I ask one final question?
Sure, please go
Uh,
ahead.
So how do we restore faith in authority, science, education, democracy, and the rule of law?
If I knew, I'd run for office. I think I think what Donald Trump will do that for us. That is, the performance of him and his administration is likely to remind people that expertise is not a bad thing, that knowledge is good, that facts matter, because the consequences of ignoring them can be pretty disastrous. That is, I would expect the consequences of a populist concept of how to think about the world and try to deal with it is not going to have positive effects and not going to have attractive effects. And I think there'll be a reminder that, you know, you got to start listening to people who know something rather than listening to people who say things that make you feel good. But I don't see that happening. I don't think there's any kind of active way we can go about doing that other than to honestly do our jobs.
Well,
Gary, you showed us that facts matter and good analysis matters. I wish that it did for more people, and maybe you give us some hope that it's going to change.
I had hoped this would be a happier occasion.
Yeah.
And that my analysis would be rather different. But
okay.
It is what it is, and we're going to live with the consequences for at least 4 years.
Well, okay, so 4 years from now, we'll have you back, Gary. And,
I hope so.
I'm joining the American Association. It's wonderful to see so many people out. You see, it's a very congenial and very well, educated group that we're talking to here. So anyway, so thank you very, very much. And
you're welcome. Happy to talk to you all.
okay. 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 So